lecture might be particularly important to you because you may be considered to be a terrorist by the United States government.
Our first speaker, Dara Lovitz, is the author of Muzzling a Movement, the Effects of Anti-Terrorism, Law, Money, and Politics on Animal Activism, and has written legal scholarship on legislation that targets animal and environmental activists as domestic terrorists. She has taught animal law at Temple and Drexel Law Schools and is a board member of the animal advocacy organization 4 Feet Forward. She has worked as a litigator in Philadelphia and served as a special prosecutor in a landmark Pennsylvania case determining an egg factory's criminal liability. It is a privilege to share in her presentation on the passage of ETA and its impact on animal activism and free speech in the United States.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to get an idea of who's in the room. So could you do me a favor and raise your hand if you're a law student or a lawyer? Now, raise your hand if you consider yourself to be an animal activist. That's someone who rescues, is a vegan, animal rights activist, okay? Now, raise your hand if you're a federal agent. Okay. All right, fine. If you raise your hand for the second question, that you consider yourself to be an animal activist, this lecture might be particularly important to you because you may be considered to be a terrorist by the United States government. Before I get started, I want to talk about the roadmap so you know where I'm going. First, I'm going to talk about the First Amendment. That's the foundation of our discussion. Then I will talk about eco-terror laws generally, and then the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is the federal eco-terror law. And when I talk about that, I will refer to it as the AETA. So just so you know, AETA is Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I'm going to talk about its basic provisions, the history leading up to it, money and politics behind it, the constitutional implications, and then I'll conclude, and then we'll have the privilege of hearing Andy speak. So, like I said, I want to get started with the First Amendment. And as we know, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, which I underlined, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress for grievances. And my focus is going to be on the freedom of speech part of the First Amendment. To that end, the court has made specific rules stating that you cannot discriminate against someone for his or her viewpoint. So if you disagree with the opinion, tough, that person has the right to speak just as much as anybody else. The Supreme Court of the United States said suppression of speech based on its content completely undercuts the profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And for all of us in here, it's important to know that that means that anybody can speak regardless of his or her message. Even messages that we may not like are protected by the First Amendment. Hate speech, bigotry, racism, a lot of those messages with which we may not disagree are protected by the First Amendment, just as our opinions are protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment was written to protect people who dissent, to protect people who disagree with the majority. The First Amendment was not created to protect President Obama when he talks about health care, although it can protect. The government speaks. The First Amendment was designed to protect the government. The First Amendment was designed to protect those of us who disagree with the government, those of us who disagree with the majority, the minority voice, the unpopular voice. All of those voices are considered protected by the First Amendment. And Noam Chomsky had a great quote about this. If we don't believe in freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. In other words, it doesn't just apply to us, it applies to everybody, whether we like the message or not. So that's the basis. Now I want to talk about eco-terror laws generally. Eco-terror. So we have eco, which is the prefix, and it seems to connote the environment. And then we have terror, which people associate with Osama bin Laden, and that connotes fear, someone who inflicts fear for a political agenda. Now, it's interesting that the government decided to juxtapose these two terms, environmental and terrorist. And the original definition of eco-terror just applied to environmental radicals, environmental extremists. animal rights activists were added to the mix with the Animal and Ecological Terrorism Act, which then was designed to penalize persons who are found to encourage acts of animal or ecological terrorism. So now it's animal rights activists and environmentalists who are considered eco-terrorists. And I ask you, who is a real terrorist? Isn't it subjective whom we call a terrorist? A New York Times columnist said, the name you choose to give violence not only reflects your view about the current state of affairs, but is also an indication of where you stand on what our policy should be. Labels are language's shorthand for judgment. Labels are language's shorthand for judgment. So whom we call a terrorist reflects more us in our judgment and less about the person we're calling a terrorist. Examples of this, and you probably heard the quote, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Raise your hand if you've heard that quote. Okay, it's the same concept. Historically, there are a lot of examples that we can think of where somebody was once considered a terrorist, but then in retrospect considered a freedom fighter. For instance, Menachem Begin, former Israeli prime minister, Nobel Peace Prize winner. He was considered a terrorist by the British authorities in the 1940s when he was opposing the British authority, the British ruling in what was then Palestine. Interestingly, Yitzhak Shamir, the prime minister who succeeded him in Israel, also considered a terrorist by the British authorities. The American revolutionaries. Think about the economic sabotage, the Boston Tea Party. Although the word terrorism didn't exist then, they would have been considered terrorists by the ruling government because they were opposing the ruling of King George III and the majority government. So it's interesting that terrorists and whom we call a terrorist depends on whom we are and more about our judgment than anything else. And as I continue this, I'm going to use the word terrorist. It reflects my judgment. It reflects the typical Western judgment. But that should always be in the back of your mind. So despite their goals of trying to reduce animal suffering, animal liberationists are considered to be one of the #1 domestic terrorist threats in the country. There are over 900 hate groups in the United States, including white supremacist groups and neo-Nazi groups. Yet, animal liberationists are seen as the most violent threat to the United States by the government. So I get a little sarcastic when I talk about these things, so forgive me, but I have a little game that I'd like to play called Who is the Real Terrorist? And I'm going to show you comparisons, and you tell me what you think. A terrorist is someone you should be scared of, right? So we have Osama bin Laden, who most people consider to be a terrorist, and we have Pamela Anderson. I'll call her Pam. She's an animal rights activist, so she could be considered a terrorist by the government. What do they have in common? Let's see. Osama bin Laden has this big, heavy machine gun. Pam Anderson has big, well, I know you didn't notice. You were looking at her face. Really, what do they have in common? What do Osama and Pam Anderson have in common? Not much, I would suggest. Has anyone heard of the Atkins diet? Mm-hmm. Okay. It promotes the consumption of meat and animal proteins and eschews carbs. The widow of the man who invented the Atkins diet, her name is Ronna Atkins, and she was quoted as comparing a pro-vegetarian health group to the Taliban. So, again, I ask you, who is the real terrorist? We have Osama bin Laden and Penelope Pod. Penelope Pod is a pea pod that walks around. You may have seen her on the streets of New York. She has a sign that says, "Give peas a chance," and she promotes a vegetarian diet. So again, let's compare the two. We have Osama. He has this heavy machine gun, which he uses to yield terror, I guess. And then we have Penelope Pod, who yields peas. Has anyone been hit by a pea? I mean, I imagine that a frozen pea is harder than a cooked pea. Cooked peas are just plain mushy, and they probably couldn't do much damage. A frozen pea might be able to do damage, but maybe not the same as Osama's M16. So there doesn't seem to be much of a connection that I can find between animal rights activists who espouse the ideas of ahimsa and veganism and being kind and peaceful to all creatures, and people whom the government considers to be terrorists, who purposefully bomb buildings and do things to hurt human beings. So that's eco-terror laws. We talked about First Amendment. Let's talk about the eco-terror law, which is the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. This is the federal eco-terror law. And I saw that there weren't as many law students or lawyers in the audience, so I'm going to try to make this as the least boring possible presentation. So I want to go through it. importantly in statutes, you should go through them line by line. I underline the and the or because they completely change the meaning of the statute. So if anyone wants to go to law school, or if anyone's in law school, always pay attention to the conjunctions. But basically, someone who travels in interstate commerce, and what's important about interstate commerce is that enables the federal government to have jurisdiction over the situation. If you're committing a crime in a state and you don't cross state lines, the state government deals with you. But the second you cross state lines, it could be an interstate commerce situation. And keep in mind, most animal activist groups who have members in other states are crossing state lines all the time through internet communications, through mailings, through flyers, or through literally crossing state lines and doing something in another state. So almost always, if you're a big group, you're going to be taken care of by the federal government by this interstate commerce clause. Number 1, for the purpose of damaging or interfering with the operations of an animal enterprise and, in connection with such purpose, causes the loss of property. Now this could apply, for example, to a situation you break into a lab, not you break into a lab, destroy property, anything that has to do with animal research, the beakers, the cages, the locks, papers, records, anything. That's property destruction, and that's under the Animal Enterprise Act. And then look at this, or any real or personal property of a person or entity having a connection to an animal enterprise. A person having a connection. So it doesn't have to be the vivisector's property himself. It could be the person who invests in the vivisection lab, the person who provides insurance to the vivisection lab. Frankly, in connection to could be the person who connects to by providing mail services or cleaning services. In connection to could be really quite a lot of people. B, intentionally places a person in reasonable fear of death, or a member of the immediate family of that person. So we're not just talking about the vivisector, and we're not just talking about the person that provides insurance to the animal enterprise. We're also talking about the person who provides insurance to the animal enterprise, that person's son, that person's father, that person's sister, any member of the immediate family. And this is probably the most important part of the offense, or conspires to do so. The all-important conspiracy charge. A conspiracy is when one or more people agree to commit a crime. One person who doesn't actually commit the crime but has agreed to do so and acted in furtherance of it could be held liable for that crime, criminally liable. That's conspiracy. Unfortunately, conspires to do so is quite broadly applied. As you'll see with the Shack case that Andy will talk about, it can apply to someone who there's just circumstantial evidence through associations that that person was connected to an act that, an illegal act that occurred. So there doesn't have to be direct evidence against you in the court of law. Circumstantial would be enough. Okay, there are penalties. Restitution, you have to pay back for the damage. So the amount of damage that you caused will be computed by the animal enterprise, and you will have to pay that money back, which is probably one of the most disheartening parts of this statute, is that animal activists who want to purposefully cause economic damage and economic disruption to an animal enterprise will eventually, if caught, have to put money back into the animal enterprise. So it's not quite where you want your money to go. Definitions. Animal enterprise means almost anything you can think of. Animals for entertainment, zoos, rodeos, circuses, animals in vivisection lab, animals being used for fur, for skin, for food, for fiber, for testing. All of those are included under the definition. And there's this rules of construction, which basically says this statute is such that you're going to violate it no matter what you do, unless it's protected by the First Amendment. But look at the language here, including peaceful, picketing, or other peaceful demonstration. They're already qualifying it to peaceful. And what does peaceful mean? I don't think we would just agree necessarily on what peaceful means. So including the limit and including the way it's applied, it doesn't really seem to take effect and actually provide First Amendment protection. And statutes shouldn't be written such that they have to tell people, but this doesn't hurt the First Amendment or your First Amendment rights. So in looking at the history of the ADA, I noticed a real trend. You have an increase in the animal liberation activities, and then you have an increase in the congressional hearings that took place to design these, that took place before the ADA, and they sort of just morphed eventually into the ADA. So in the 80s, you have the break-in at the Penn Head Trauma Lab. You may have seen the video footage with the baboons. And you have the Food Security Act, which ultimately gets morphed into this Farm Animal and Research Facilities Protection Act, which coincides with the late 80s animal liberation events. And I wrote just so you know, pelt industry confinement facilities instead of fur farm, because some people don't like the term fur farm because it sounds so happy. But pelt industry confinement facilities maybe designates a little bit better when they rip skin off of animals while they're still alive, that's what's taking place there. But anyway, in this statute that was created in 1989, they discussed the destructive nature of terrorist acts against research facilities which have slowed medical research that is dedicated to improving human well-being and denying hope to those with presently incurable diseases. That is always the focus when they're talking about animal rights terrorists, that the people who really suffer are the people who are waiting for a cure to a disease. We have some negative quotes from the British Animal Liberation Front that alludes to violence against vivisectors, coinciding with Congress directing 1 million reports, that's an exaggeration, several reports on animal rights extremism. Rick Scarce, a sociology professor, was imprisoned for refusing to testify in front of the grand jury about Rod Coronado, whom you may have heard of, an environmental and animal rights activist. And he spent 159 days in jail. And then the Animal Enterprise Protection Act was passed, which again was necessary to combat the animal rights terrorist creation of a growing atmosphere of fear among farmers and researchers, people to whom the nation owes so much. Again, there's this constant contrast between animal rights activists and the heroes of our country, which are the people who perform animal testing and the people who are farming animals for us to eat. 1997, we have the Peter Young and Justin Samuel raid of several pelt industry confinement facilities in the Midwest, and we have the House hearing acts of eco-terrorism by radical environmental organizations, again considered the growing and extremely disturbing problem of violent acts by radical animal rights, and SHAC. Andy will talk about SHAC in more detail, and their damage, their economic damage that they caused to this particular vivisection lab spanned a couple years, and in 2004 we have this Senate hearing. Chairman Orrin Hatch said, when vivisectors or their labs are targeted, the ones who lose most are the ones with the disease or who are watching a loved one struggling with a devastating illness. And Representative Don Young, when interviewed by the Alaska Daily News after 9/11, immediately after, he said that there was a strong possibility that eco-terrorists were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And in the late 2004 to 2006, again, Andy will talk about the SHAC arrest and prosecution. We had the Senate hearing, and then we had a House hearing on the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So the statute under which SHAC was prosecuted, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, at this point was morphed into the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, signed by President Bush into law in late 2006. That was a very fast history. I have a much more detailed version of it in my book, which I'll plug later shamelessly, and you'll enjoy it. So then, when I was looking at the ADA specifically, and a lot of legislation that preceded it, I wanted to know what incentive do these politicians have to pass such a law? To me, the law seems totally offensive, but why? What would politically motivate these Congress people and the senators to pass such a law, to sponsor the law, to get behind it, to push other people to promote it? And I decided to follow the money, so to speak. So I looked into the campaign dollars behind these politicians. And I noticed a clear connection between the politicians who strongly sponsored the ADA and the other animal enterprise terrorism laws and campaign dollars from people who have a real interest in shutting up animal rights activists. So for instance, I looked at Senator James Inhofe, who I think, has anyone seen this quote? Global warming is the greatest hoax perpetrated on the American people. He's not just offensive to environmentalists, but also to animal rights activists. He, for each Congress term he served, the American Farm Bureau is named him Friend of Farm Bureau. In 2005, the Oklahoma Farm Bureau honored him with the Lifetime Achievement Award. The Oklahoma Pork Council gave him a Distinguished Service Award. Charles Stenholm, Democrat from Texas, congressperson, he actually introduced the Farm Animal and Research Facilities Protection Act. I think we talked about that in the history. Throughout his congressional career, the United States animal agriculture industry gave him more than $2.5 million in donations. The following industries contributed over $1.1 million. The egg industry, the dairy industry, the poultry industry, and the livestock industry. And among his top 10 contributors were the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Dairy Farmers of America, and the United Egg Association. Obviously, groups that have a real issue with people who are espousing veganism and not eating dairy, eggs, and meat. And lastly, Now, in my book, I mentioned several other politicians. I'm just mentioning some big ones here and some ones you might have heard of. Dianne Feinstein, a senator from California, she also co-sponsored the ADA with Inhofe. And I was shocked because Dianne Feinstein is usually someone whom most of us admire. And when I looked at her contributors, her top contributors, I didn't see any connection. It was mostly entertainment industry, senior citizen communities, women's rights groups. I mean, what do these people have against animal rights activists? I didn't get it. So I looked beyond her political office and into her bedroom. Not in a creepy way, just Google, Google. And I found that her husband, Richard Blum, is the chairman of the C.B. Richard Ellis Group. The C.B. Richard Ellis Group is a large firm that deals in commercial real estate with pharmaceutical companies. Specifically, their biggest clients are AstraZeneca, Bayer Pharmaceuticals, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Novartis, Pfizer, Schering-Plough, Wyeth. So you see a connection. There's the pharmaceutical connection. And I found out, she was an enigma for so long, and I finally got to the bottom of that. So that's Feinstein. So I talked about, the First Amendment, eco-terror laws generally, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act basic provisions, the history, the money and politics, and I want to talk about the constitutional implications briefly. Abridgment of speech. I believe that it's abridging animal rights activist speech because we don't feel free to speak when we're considered possibly to be terrorists. Viewpoint discrimination. There aren't statutes that target the viewpoints of NRA activists, pro-lifers, Democrats, Republicans, all those other groups with their opinions that may not be the majority opinions don't have to deal with a federal statute and face possible federal prosecution. And the federalization of state crimes, I mentioned the word federal a lot. A federal crime is much more serious than a state crime. It carries the issue of a grand jury, it carries serious penalties, and in general, federal cases, they're more likely to be won by the prosecutor than state criminal cases. And the result to this is silence, unfortunately. There's a stigma to being called a terrorist, obviously. People don't want to be accused of a terrorist, and being called a terrorist takes with it all kinds of flagging. Aggressive federal efforts, and by this I mean the aggressive federal nature to encourage snitching, which is cooperating in euphemism terms by the government, but it's snitching. And I think snitching is one of the main things that dismantles a movement. And then media concerns. I don't know if you remember, if you heard Daniel Sandiego was accused of bombing 2 corporate offices that had connections to animal testing labs. And when they covered this story, they kept mentioning that he was a vegan. So a title of a UK Times Online featured this matter. It said, "Vegan Daniel Sandiego, who tried to close British animal lab, is put on the FBI list." A Fox News reporter described Sandiego as a strict vegan whose face masks a violent hate that turned him into an eco-terrorist. And this is the best part. A vicious vegan with an axe to grind. As though his connection with veganism and the fact that he doesn't, he loves tofu, as though that has anything to do with his alleged involvement in the bombing of a corporate building. So, the media can be your best friend or it can be your worst enemy, depending on who the journalist is. But that's my concern. Now, I call the book, this is the shameless plug part that I was telling you about. If you don't listen to anything I say, I urge you to listen to this part because my financial well-being depends on it. So I wrote this book, Muzzling a Movement, which will be out soon by Lantern Books. If you're interested in reading the book, more importantly, if you're interested in purchasing it, you can read it. I would love it if you read it. But if you purchased it, if you're interested in purchasing it, please sign up in the back. Lantern Books is right there. Martin Rowe is raising his hand. And sign my sheet. That's a sign-up sheet. You can put your name and email address. I'll let you know when the book is out and ready to be purchased with cash or credit card or for your firstborn. So the book will be ready for you. I called it Muzzling a Movement because I was concerned. I was fearful that with this aggressive anti-terrorism legislation and all the corporate dollars that are aligned against us, animal rights activists would be silenced and we'd be fearful of getting out there and stating our cause. And it's so important that we get out there and state our cause because, as we know, non-human animals don't have a voice in our society. We need to maintain that voice and keep it strong. So, I ask you, animal activists out there, to be vigilant, to be knowledgeable about the law, and most importantly, please do not stop the fight. Thank you.